Hello and welcome to the Dissect and Connect podcast. I'm your host, Mike Wade. This is the podcast where we explore population health issues impacting your community. Dissect and Connect is a service of New River Valley Community Services and the Montgomery County Prevention Partners. Rick Mountcastle is an Assistant Attorney General for the Commonwealth of Virginia and a retired federal prosecutor. Operating from a small satellite U.S. Attorney's office in Abingdon, Virginia, Rick led the investigation and prosecution of Purdue Pharma, as well as its CEO, General Counsel, and Chief Medical Officer, in an unprecedented case that, at the inception of the opioid crisis, held an opioid manufacturer and its top executives criminally and civilly responsible for falsely marketing OxyContin. As many of you know, this case was well documented in Beth Macy's best-selling book Dopesick, which was eventually adapted for the Hulu television series of the same name, starring Michael Keaton. After moving to the U.S. Attorney's Office headquarters in Roanoke, Virginia, Rick led the investigation and prosecution of Abbott Laboratories for its false marketing of the epilepsy drug Depakote, resulting in criminal and civil penalties totaling $1.5 billion, which at the time was the largest pharmaceutical settlement involving a single drug in U.S. history. As acting interim U.S. Attorney from January 2017 through April 2018, Rick led the federal response to the violence at the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally on August 12, 2017, personally directing the opening of the federal civil rights investigation of Heather Heyer's killer and other violent extremists, ensuring that the federal case was staffed by the office's best attorneys while coordinating with the local prosecutor's office and the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, as well as the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He also initiated the Federal State Task Force to address gang violence in Danville, Virginia, resulting in the return of federal indictments against members of two violent gangs. Now with the Virginia Attorney General's Office, Rick currently works to address the opioid crisis by conducting parallel criminal-civil investigations of healthcare providers who prescribe controlled substances without legitimate medical purpose. So, Rick, welcome to the Dissect and Connect podcast. It's an honor to have you on the show.
Honor for me to be here.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation with me. So let's jump right in. I know it's probably on the minds of folks who are tuning in for this episode. The Dopesick Hulu series has been out for a little while now and has gotten a lot of acclaim from both critics and audiences alike. But you've kind of been in the middle of it, so I have to ask, what's all the hype been like for you personally?
Yeah, so Mike, let me just make one kind of disclaimer, being as I'm a lawyer and,
Sure.
and we do this kind of thing. Just to be clear, my statements and comments during this podcast are my personal views and opinions. They're in no way related to any position I may hold with the Attorney General's office or otherwise. So I just wanted to make that clear. So the Hulu hype and all that has been kind of surreal, is one way I've described it. Certainly was unexpected. The case was ended in 2007, and here we are 14 years later, and there's a big, mini series, and all of a sudden I've got this 15 minutes of fame. And so one of the things that hit me was I had to ask myself, what do I do with this 15 minutes of fame? Because, it's gratifying to have your work recognized, maybe even 10, 15 years later. But what am I going to do with this fame that people want to talk to me? And so I decided on two things. I wanted to promote and talk about the victims of opioid addiction. And I wanted to talk about changing how we view people who are addicted to opioids. It is a disease. They should not be vilified. We need to treat them with compassion and provide the treatment resources necessary to help them. So that's one of the things. And the other thing I wanted to do was to talk about what justice looks like at the end of the day for the case, because there's a second case, as you probably know, that was just recently settled by the Department of Justice in 2020, involving, of course, the same company, Purdue Pharma, and involving the same crimes that they were already convicted of in 2007, some of which I believe are worse, and yet no individuals have been prosecuted. And is that justice? And I wanted to have that conversation as well. So those are kind of the two things that I decided to speak to during this 15 minutes of fame that I have.
Well, since you brought it up, I have to ask. I mean, with things where they are with the case and no one being brought to justice per se, how does that make you feel as the prosecuting attorney in the original case?
It makes me feel kind of disappointed, but at the same time, it's not unexpected. We've got a great justice system, probably, I would say, and I've said it before, the best justice system in the world. But of course, it's not without its flaws. And one of the flaws is that people with lots of money and lots of influence can, what I would say, bend the arc of justice to suit their needs. So in this particular case, it just seems unfair. I will tell you that I've spoken to a number of individuals who have lost loved ones to opioid addiction, both back in the 2007 timeframe, but also more recently in 2015, 16, 17, and 18. And they really want justice, okay? And I can understand that. And so it makes me feel like there's unfinished business, there's unfinished work that needs to be done. And so there's been a lot of discussion, and I've participated in some of that discussion about asking the Department of Justice to relook at the evidence of the case that was just completed in 2020 and look at that evidence in terms of prosecuting individuals. So, I guess the feeling I would have is, hey, there's more work to be done. It's not over. We need to get justice.
To be continued, as they say in Hollywood.
Yes.
Well, let me ask you, now that the series has had its run, were you satisfied with how it turned out?
Yes, I was. I was very pleased about it. I spent a lot of time speaking with the creator and showrunner, as they call him, because he was the writer. He directed some of the episodes. He was the executive producer. That's Danny Strawn. And I told him at the very beginning when he first came to see me back in the spring of 2019 that the main reason I was sitting down with him and spending time with him is I wanted the truth to come out. And so as far as the investigation that's depicted in the series, our U.S. Attorney's Office's investigation and the crimes that we uncovered, those are in substance there. They are accurate, factually accurate, although, of course, the details have been embellished and dramatized for purposes of television.
Sure.
But, the meetings that they showed, the substance of those meetings, the interviews that we did, the evidence that was produced about how Purdue marketed the drug, that substance is accurate. The thing I'm most pleased about the show, however, is how it depicts people who are addicted to opioids. They are humans, and the show makes it clear it humanizes them. And that's kind of the attitude that we need to take. I mean, Purdue wanted us to vilify them. Purdue wanted us to blame them for the addicts for the opioid crisis. Even though Purdue made them addicts, they wanted us to blame them. And we should not do that. Our society needs to change how it looks at people who are addicted to opioids. It's a disease. It's a very serious disease. It's very difficult to cure for folks to come off of opioids. And we need to reach out to them with compassion. We need to provide the resources that are necessary to help them beat that addiction. So the fact is, the way the show humanized those addicted, and the way and the other part of it, the second piece that I was really most pleased about the series was the way it showed the struggle of families who have loved ones, who are dealing with loved ones who are addicted, and many of whom are dealing with the loss of a loved one to an opioid overdose. And I've spent a lot of time since the show came out talking to many of those families and kind of trying to understand, what they're dealing with. It's unimaginable, the pain that they're dealing with, but also trying to understand what justice looks like for them.
Before we jump into the rest of our conversation, though, I was hoping you might just kind of backtrack your career and talk about your career path and how you arrived where you are today.
Sure. So I went to college on an ROTC scholarship, which meant that upon graduation, I owed the Army 4 years of service. I delayed that to go to law school. When I completed law school, I joined the Army, went on active duty as a JAG officer for a little over 4 years. When I completed that, I went to work for an agency in D.C. at the Department of Transportation, I guess looking back, more of a mundane job. I did mostly personnel work for the Federal Railroad Administration. And then I went to the Department of Justice after a couple of years at Federal Railroad and worked in the tax division, doing criminal tax work. Two areas that when I graduated from law school, I said I would never work in. And I said to myself, I'll never do criminal law and I'll never do tax law. And lo and behold, I'm working in criminal tax at the Department of Justice. And I did that for almost 9 years before I transferred to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Abingdon, which is where, about 7 years into my tenure there is where the Purdue case got started. Mm-hmm. And so I transferred to Roanoke right at the end of the Purdue case in 2007 to the main office for the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Virginia. And I held different positions in the civil division. Ended up being a supervisor for my last 8 years and retired from there at the end of 2018. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, my career path.
So in addition to the case against Purdue Pharma, I mentioned in the intro that you also successfully prosecuted against Abbott Laboratories and won a huge settlement against that company. Looking back, were there any similarities between the two cases, between Abbott and Purdue?
Most definitely. And so, I'll start off talking about it this way. I've looked at not just Purdue, but of course Abbott Labs and the way that other pharmaceutical companies do business. And Purdue was not really, they followed the playbook pretty much. So in the Purdue case, you had Purdue using false and misleading statements to market OxyContin as non-addictive, completely false, less abusable than any other opioids, completely false. Abbott used false and misleading statements to market Depakote, even though it was not approved for this particular use, but it marketed it as safe and effective for the treatment of agitation in dementia patients who were in nursing homes. Depakote had been approved by the FDA for the treatment of epileptic seizures, for the treatment of bipolar mania, and for the treatment of migraine headaches, never for the treatment of agitation in dementia patients in nursing homes. And so, but they falsely and misleadingly told the healthcare providers in those nursing homes that Depakote was a safe and effective alternative to the atypical antipsychotics that had been used back then for treatment of agitation. Again, looking at their targeted market, they both targeted what I'll call vulnerable people. Vulnerable in the sense that they did not have a voice. They were somewhat marginalized on the margins of society. So, for example, Purdue targeted people who had chronic pain. And I will say this, I believe that Purdue targeted people who were addicted to opioids, okay? And they wanted them to switch from the other opioids that they were using because of that addiction, like the Percocets, the Lortabs, mm-hmm. And they wanted them to switch to OxyContin. And of course, people who are addicted are not viewed as being very credible by other folks in society. And the other thing Purdue did was they targeted initially for their launch to get the market share. They targeted rural communities, okay, both in Virginia and Kentucky and Maine, places where you have working people who don't have a big voice, right? They don't have a lot of political pull. Those are the people they targeted. Abbott similarly targeted elderly people confined to nursing homes, suffering from dementia, so they had a very difficult time communicating. They followed that same playbook. They targeted people who couldn't speak up and to complain. The third thing, and I know there are probably many more, but the third thing that hit me in terms of the similarities was that both companies used medical journal articles in a very misleading way to convince physicians that their their false claims were legitimate and that the physician should prescribe their drug. So there was this manipulation of this, medical, scholarly community to serve their ends, to make sales. Mm-hmm. So those are kind of the three things that really struck me as being similar between the two cases.
Well, I was going to ask, and maybe with your insight there, it might be a different question, but let's start here and see where it goes. The two cases that you've prosecuted, pretty significant. Does this speak to the larger issue around America's dependency on medications?
I'm going to answer the question a little bit differently. I think it actually speaks more to the corruption in the healthcare business as a whole. Okay, because I've also done cases that involve skilled nursing facilities or nursing homes, that involve, physicians and other aspects of the healthcare business. And there's kind of a little bit of a corruption throughout. What I would say just generally, and of course this doesn't apply to everybody, but what I see with those that are committing crimes, that the goal of increasing profits outweighs any health or safety concern for the patients. Okay. People are viewed as commodities or as revenue sources. And so that's sort of the common theme that underlines not just the pharmaceutical business, but the healthcare business in generally, where you have that corrupt piece of it or part of it. Government regulatory agencies, right, who we think are out there, they're protecting us from that kind of stuff, like FDA and Health and Human Services and others. Well, the truth of the matter is they don't have the resources or the moral will, and I'll speak about what I mean by moral will in a minute,
okay,
to really protect the public from false advertising and marketing, false marketing, and from the treatment of patients as commodities, okay? So just as an example in terms of the lack of resources, in 2010, the FDA has this Office of Prescription Drug Promotion, and their job is to look at all of the promotional materials for prescription drugs that, particularly the promotion direct to consumer, direct to patient. They are charged with reviewing all the promotional materials that are put out by the pharmaceutical companies. So, in 2010, they had a staff of 57. And they were responsible for reviewing more than 75,000 promotional and advertising pieces. That's impossible, right?
Yeah.
So if we're relying on the FDA to protect us from false advertising, that's probably not going to happen, right? With those kinds of numbers. The second thing is that, and I'll talk about this moral will. What I mean by that is that, surprisingly, probably, I would say I was surprised to find, because I really dug into this, that there is nothing illegal about an employee of the FDA or other government agency who is assigned to review and regulate a company and a company's conduct from leaving their position with the government and turning around and going to work for that very same company at double or triple the salary. That kind of creates this pull. If you're a government bureaucrat in DC making, I'm going to just pick a number, ballpark number, it's probably under $175,000, $80,000 a year. And your job is to watchdog over a pharmaceutical company, but you know that once you leave the government, you could get a job with that very same pharmaceutical company. It's going to be pretty hard for you as a human being to really be strict and really be hardcore with that company, right? It's just human nature.
Yeah.
And so that lack of moral will and the fact that it's not illegal to turn around and I don't necessarily want to do a spoiler, but if, I think it's very early in the series, and this is one of the first things that kind of hit us in the face is the label on OxyContin had a ridiculous statement in it that delayed absorption as provided by OxyContin tablets is believed to reduce the abuse liability of a drug. That was approved by this FDA employee who was responsible for overseeing the approval of the drug, Curtis Wright, who is talked about in the series. And that, if you think about that statement, it's complete nonsense. But it is something that fed to the marketing of OxyContin as less addictive and less abusable, and was used initially by the company to do that. Curtis Wright, of course, ended up going to work at Purdue at 3 or 4 times his FDA salary. And there was nothing illegal about that. And so, that is the thing, I think, that one of the things that we have work to do with. The system exists, and people need to understand it. They need to realize that. They need to look at things very critically that go through that system. The system exists that has this pull towards corruption. It's just human nature, right?
Yeah.
You want to do better for yourself, and you have an opportunity to go with this company and make a lot more money, and you're going to curry favor with them. You're not going to be hardcore with them because that opportunity might dissipate. So that's something that I think is a problem in the healthcare business as a whole. So those are the things that I think are, clear to me as being problems that we need to work on.
The whole thing around the FDA and the OxyContin label was just jaw-dropping, mind-blowing, scary. I think a lot of us have flown under the radar of the FDA and organizations like that looking out for the consumer, and, we could trust what was going on there, but it certainly makes you question some of the decision-making.
Right. You just have to understand that it's run by people who have self-interest as usually number one. It's something that we fight, all of us fight with every day.
Yeah.
Right. And that's just the way the system is. And you just got to be aware of that and protect yourself.
Well, you've already spoken to the larger issue and concerns around the healthcare industry in general, not including everyone, of course. But besides healthcare and the pharmaceutical industry, who else do you feel is to blame for America's addiction crisis?
Yeah, so, and I don't know, this might just be semantics. I prefer not to call it blame. I guess the question is who is responsible.
Okay.
And we want to know who's responsible, right? To determine who should be held accountable, because there's an accountability piece of justice. And what do we need to do to prevent it to fix it and prevent it from happening again? And, in thinking about this question before this interview, I kind of came up with a very long list. There are many who are responsible, and some of that responsibility might even rest with us. Okay, so I'll kind of get into that.
Okay.
So I'm going to go through my list here. So certainly, direct responsibility for the opioid crisis rests in large part with the Sackler family, the owners of Purdue Pharma, all right, who kind of changed the dynamic of how the healthcare providers looked at the treatment of pain. And they did it in a way that's depicted in the series, I think, pretty accurately. They infiltrated all of the public service agencies, or what we thought were public service agencies. They funded them, okay, Partners Against Pain and National Pain Society, and part of that funding was to come up and promote the use of opioids as a tier one, as a number one treatment of pain, and not just severe pain. Okay, so they broadened that, and then they did. And the way they did that was to lie about the addiction and abusability, the addiction potential and abusability of the drug. And what is particularly concerning about the Sackler family and Purdue is that we caught them in 2007. The company pled guilty to a serious felony in 2007, admitted that it lied in the promotion of the drug. We actually managed to prosecute despite opposition from the political appointees at the Department of Justice. We did get 3 top executives to plead guilty. Granted, it was misdemeanors, but we got something. We thought we might not get anything on individuals, but we got those 3 individuals to be held responsible. The company turns around probably almost immediately after that conviction, the Sackler family, because they skated. They dodged a bullet. They turned around and continued for the next 10 years to market OxyContin illegally. And then they added in some other drugs as well. And so the arrogance of doing that caused the opioid epidemic, which had begun in the early years, the 1996 to 2007 period, that caused it to explode after 2007 up to the present time. So certainly they're number one on the list of who's responsible. I also think the medical community bears a significant responsibility. And I know this is going to probably upset many of your listeners, but I think that the prescribing folks, the physicians who prescribed opioids back in those early years, basically abdicated their responsibility to make decisions that were in the best interest of their patients by prescribing opioids based on blatantly false statements. I mean, when a pharmaceutical representative, who most of them have no medical training, okay, they might have a bachelor's degree in art history, English, and I'm not saying anything bad about those majors, but when they walk into a doctor's office, a physician who has a medical degree, who's been practicing medicine for a number of years, and tell the doctor, see, here's this statement. The FDA said delayed absorption is provided by OxyContin tablets is believed to reduce the abuse liability of the drug. I don't have any medical training. I can read that statement and say, that's meaningless. That's nonsense. And tell me that physicians, there are physicians who say today, oh, we were duped. We were misled by the drug company, by Purdue, by its sales reps. I find that really hard to believe, unless they are also going to say that they switched their brains off and decided to do whatever the drug companies wanted to do. So I think that those medical providers that decided they would use that Purdue marketing as an excuse to write opioid prescriptions, they're responsible as well. Okay, and significantly responsible. I've already spoken to the FDA's bureaucratic inefficiency and their lack of moral will or corruption that allowed that marketing to go on for, looks like to me, not just once, but for a second set after 2007. They certainly bear responsibility. I've already spoken at length about that. I'm not going to go back into that. And I think that, the law enforcement system, kind of bears some responsibility as well. In this particular case, we have now a two-time offender, Purdue Pharma. The company pled guilty in 2020 to crimes that were more serious than what they pled guilty to in 2007. In 2020, even with the more serious crimes, not a single individual has been prosecuted to date. And the company didn't do business by itself. It had executives who charted out a course of conducting business. It had executives who approved the crimes that were committed by the company to which the company pled guilty. And so the fact that no individuals have been prosecuted for this two-time offender, again, speaks to me about a deficiency in the law enforcement system. So let me get to the all of this part of it, okay? I mean, I'll admit I was part of this, okay?
Okay. My
attitude toward people addicted to drugs was kind of dismissive, kind of, maybe demonizing of them. It's, they're doing it to themselves kind of thing. And I've learned so much more, though, working on this case and talking to people who got addicted to opioids. And that's not the right way for us to look at it. Because while Purdue was marketing OxyContin as less than 1% of the people who use it as directed by a physician get addicted, I'm talking to people who got addicted to it, using it as directed under the care of a physician, who told me it only takes 3 to 5 days of using it as directed to become addicted. Okay. Mm-hmm. And in those early years, they were getting 30-day supplies. That was the typical supply. So let's not demonize people who are addicted to opioid. Let's destigmatize that addiction, because by demonizing them and making it a stigma, you are preventing families from asking for help. Okay. And we got to stop doing that. And so I blame kind of our societal views and how we look at opioid addiction we have a role in how this crisis has continued and expanded. And we can reverse that. So that's kind of my list.
That's a pretty comprehensive list, and I think it's a pretty fair assessment. Well, we know that overdose has not gone away. The issue has not gotten any better. In fact, it's gotten worse. There's been reports about a record high of number of deaths in America from overdose over the last 12 months, over 100,000 Americans who have died from overdose. A lot of that's being attributed to fentanyl, which is the highly potent opioid painkiller that is being manufactured, sold, distributed illicitly. And so with that in mind, there's no Sackler family to go after or take down. So how do we address that and turn things around?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question because we've been fighting the war on drugs for almost 40 years now.
Yeah.
In terms of the law enforcement side of it, which is going out and arresting people, prosecuting people, sending them off to jail, maybe trying to go after a cartel every once in a while. All very resource intensive, all very difficult to do, the cartel part of it. And the problem with the war on drugs is that, again, this is a flaw in our system. Our system for law enforcement is statistics driven. Okay. And so when Congress issues the funding, because a lot of this is federal money, it comes down to the states and the locals for law enforcement purposes, particularly in the drug arena. When they do that, when the agencies dole out the money, it's all based on statistics. How many people did you arrest? How many people did you convict? How many drugs did you seize? How much money did you seize or forfeit? And the problem with that is that encourages what I'll call the low-hanging fruit approach to law enforcement. And now it's all about numbers, statistics for the sake of statistics. Well, if you're going to go after a cartel or a company, you're not going to turn the numbers. You're not going to rack up the statistics. It's going to take you years, a year or 2 years of just focusing on that one target, that one high level supplier, that one cartel, which I think is where law enforcement should be going after. And you're not generating the statistics. And then there's going to be pressure from the folks in charge of various government agencies to say, hey, no statistics, no money. So now the emphasis is on, let's go out and just round up the usual suspects of street dealers, because you can do 15 or 20 of those cases in a matter of weeks or months.
Right.
And you rack up the statistics and you keep everybody happy and you keep the money flowing. So I have a real problem with statistics-driven law enforcement, and that's the way we've been doing it for 40 years. And after 40 years, when you look around and it's not working, maybe it's time to change. Okay. I think that we need to do, I started hearing this before I retired from the U.S. Attorney's Office. I started hearing high-level supervisors in the DEA and other agencies that are involved in law enforcement with respect to drugs making the statement, we can't arrest our way out of this crisis. All that to mean is that we need to look at the demand side, not just the supply side. Okay. So let's face it, if we take down every cartel that's out there, but there are still people who are addicted to drugs, there's going to be a demand for it, and somebody's going to provide them with drugs.
Right.
Okay. And it hasn't worked for 40 years. We've been doing the same thing, and it's getting worse. We have, like you said, more than 100,000 people dying of opioid overdoses a year. I mean, we're pushing 1 million, I think, if you go back to the last 20 years.
Right.
1 million people have died of close to 1 million people have died of opioid overdoses. So I don't think that it's been a success. And I think we need to focus on the demand reduction. We need to focus on the people who are addicted. We need to save lives. We need to destigmatized so that people don't have a barrier to reaching out for help, so that families can reach out for help without feeling like, ashamed, and they shouldn't feel ashamed. That's kind of my message for today, for this podcast. And we need to provide resources for treatment of opioid addiction that is scientifically based. Again, I've come around again. I used to be of the school of thought that, this medication assistance treatment, this methadone and this Suboxone stuff, that's just replacing one drug with another. And what you really need to do is to go cold turkey and abstinence, and that's the key. That obviously doesn't work. Okay. And the science is there to prove that doesn't work. So I've said, whatever works for that individual, let's do it. If it's medication assisted treatment, then we need to put resources into it. We need to be flexible to what works. So I think that our focus now ought to be on that demand side, that demand reduction. The other thing we need to do also, there's a third prong to this. You got law enforcement, you got treatment, and you got prevention. Okay. And to me, once the horse is out of the barn, it's too late to close the barn door. Once people are addicted, it's really, really hard to get them off. But if we can go in and do prevention and I think starting in elementary school now, prevention programs, that is really probably the best way to get at the problem in the long run.
It doesn't get the attention that law enforcement and treatment does, but I totally agree with you that prevention is where it's at, and it's not. It's never too early to have those conversations, and I think going into early elementary classrooms to talk about making good choices and staying away from things that might harm you are good conversations to have. I don't think you can ever be too young for those conversations, because kids are getting exposed to that at very young ages these days. They live with it, they see it at home.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And the effects, aside from the opioid overdose deaths, which is horrific. Okay, that number is horrible. But what it does to the families, to the homes, you've got a whole secondary tier of victims that nobody really thinks about. The children in those homes who have parents who are addicted to opioids, they're victims.
Absolutely.
The family members that have to try to come in and pick up the pieces because, they're victims. Prevention, I think, is really important, not talked about enough. I think there's a little bit of a community stigma attached to that.
Sure.
Like you go into some communities and say, we don't need any prevention. There's nothing to see here. There's no problem here. And I'll tell an anecdote. I mean, it's not based on science. It's just a sort of a personal experience. Back in 2017 and 18, when I was with the U.S. Attorney's Office, we were the federal courts system, and judges were putting on us, and some of the folks in the community, in the addiction prevention community, were putting on a series of meetings at local high schools in Southwest County, Roanoke County, which is a pretty, I would say is fairly affluent. My son was going to a high school in the county, and I told them, we're going to the program, you and I. This is information you need to have. I know you're not doing drugs. I know you're not taking pills, but you need to know about this stuff because you make good choices if you've got good information.
Right.
So I took him to this program, and we were in the auditorium of the high school. It was a pathetic turnout. There were almost no parents, very few students. Many of the students were there because they could get extra credit in some class if they showed up. And there was a discussion that went on. And as we were walking out, I asked my son, do you know any of the folks that go to this school, any of the other students that go to the school that take pills? And he said, yes. And I said, well, how many of them do you think take pills? He said, everyone. And the fact that there was nobody at that meeting showed me that there's this denial there. And we somehow got to overcome that, because those kids, they're going to be making choices. You want to participate in this pill party or not? Are you going to take that pill that's being offered to you or not? And they need to have information in order to make those good choices. And if they're not receiving that information, bad choices get made.
And I think there is an issue of denial, and unfortunately, sometimes that doesn't change until someone in the immediate family succumbs to addiction or experimentation. with substances that they don't know exactly what they're putting in their bodies. And then it's too late to care, to inform yourself.
Yeah. I mean, once you're addicted, it is extremely difficult to reverse that. And so let's just, prevention is so much easier. It's so much cheaper. Right?
Yeah, there's that too.
Yeah.
Well, we're about to wrap up, but I wondered if there might be any resources that you would be interested in pointing our listeners to.
So if you're interested in learning more about Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family, a book by Patrick Radden, R-A-D-D-E-N, Keefe, called Empire of Pain, is a very informative book. It's very lengthy because it tracks the history of that family going back to the 1920s, but it's very eye-opening. For anybody that's facing some kind of substance abuse disorder, or has a family member or a friend that's facing that, call for help. Okay, there's the number I'm going to give you is give here is the SAMHSA number. It's the helpline, 1-800-662-4357. If you're battling opioid addiction, or you have a close friend or family member who is, call for help, please.
Fantastic. Any parting words of wisdom, Rick?
I'm just going to reiterate what I've said before, is that we need to reach out as a society to those addicted to opioids with compassion, to provide resources to treat this awful disease, and to destigmatize the opioid addiction. That's what I'm, going to be repeating over and over again. We need to change our attitude about that. I have talked to many people who are addicted or who had been addicted. I've talked to many family members, and it is heartbreaking to talk to a family member who's lost someone to an opioid overdose. It is heartbreaking to talk to a family member who has a brother or sister or son or daughter who's battling addiction, and they're having to take care of their grandkids and all that. We have got to destigmatize this issue and get help out there for these people.
Well, conversations like this definitely help do that, and I can't thank you enough for being so generous with your time. Really appreciate your insight, your expertise, your knowledge, your experiences, all very helpful, and just really grateful for all that you've done over your career to help address this issue.
Well, Mike, thank you for having me, and thank you for doing this podcast, using your own time, your own personal time to get the word out. I think you're doing a great service to the community.
Thank you so much. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Dissect and Connect podcast. To learn more about Montgomery County Prevention Partners or New River Valley Community Services, be sure to check us out on Facebook or visit nrvcs.org/podcast.